nestled safely within the bosom of the city, sat the front gates leading onto the grounds of Trossum Castle. A confident Moran warrior sauntered through the gates and rubbed at her tired eyes. Unlike the peasants in the Kingdom of Nath surrounding her, she was not a human, and she was not an active morning person. However, today she had eagerly risen with the sun and was brimming with excitement to begin her journey. A raven had brought her a letter from the Lady Narama de Laslin of Trossum, which had made clear that the marked human female would no longer be in attendance on this expedition. This revelation had agitated the Moran, as her ambitions had included the manipulation of information from the Elder Marked. Narama was one of the few to have fallen victim to the barriers surrounding the Isles of Pi and survive. The Moran had long been fascinated by the secrets of these isles and was determined to uncover them all by any means necessary. Following this daydreaming Moran was a bodyguard and traveling companion, a male human and former knight. His every action broadcast to onlookers that he held many rotations of experience and training. His graceful, purposeful steps showed that he had an impeccable sense of balance. His squared shoulders and perfect posture projected the intimidating discipline that he had endured, and his handsome features wore no expression, as his ever-alert eyes consistently searched for signs of danger. The Moran smiled as the pair drew near the libraries of Trossum. All of her hard work to leave the matriarchy of Mo behind and to defy her people would finally begin to pay off for her, just as soon as she could leave the shores of the eastern continent behind. The local noblemen and ladies sneered in her direction as she jogged up the last steps leading to the large wooden doors of the library. The heated gazes from the humans fazed her little, as she had already grown accustomed to such reactions over her travels through Nath. She could care no less about the opinions of humans.
Pardon me, miss. Are you by any chance the Lady Patrik D.R of Mo?
Patrik jumped and spun on her toes to locate the owner of the small voice, as she hadn't expected any of the humans in this kingdom to know of her by name. The only person in Nath that should have been aware of Pathar's visit was Narama, but this voice was far too young to belong to the wise old headmistress.
Who's asking?
Pathar's bodyguard barely glanced over the young girl. He considered her to pose no real threat, despite the obvious markings painted down the backs of her fingers indicating her ability to cast spells. Instead, he turned his gaze onto the armored knight standing behind the girl. The kid was barely old enough to have passed his initiation, but was obviously present to act as the girl's bodyguard. Both knights sized each other up in silence with intimidating stares.
I apologize. Please, allow me to introduce myself. I am the Lady Rila Dianandra of Atham, and this is my escort, Sir Emry de Sirin of Caliphus.
Emry was uninterested in the conversation as he stood, waiting to leave. His stance was stiff, much less graceful than the stance of the older knight. Patrik eyed Rila skeptically, but said nothing as she mentally judged the girl's young appearance.
My aunt, the Lady Narama de Laslin of Trossum, she should have informed you that I would be accompanying you in her stead on this expedition.
Rila tilted her head, causing sunlight to bounce off the large gold earrings dangling from her earlobes. Patrik took an instant disliking to Rila and her sparkling attire. Surely this was a mistake. The girl appeared to be even younger than her bodyguard, and Patrik could hardly place her trust in a toddler with a sword.
You are the Lady Patrik D.R of Mo, are you not?
I was caught off guard by your sudden greeting. How do you do? I am indeed Patrik. Just Patrik. And this is my bodyguard, Sir Davamir de Sobris of Caliphus.
The former knight, Davamir, mumbled a half-hearted greeting and gave Rila a nod of his head, but he was just as uninterested in the conversation as Emry. Small talk was not one of his strong suits, you see, and he was eager to make way before he could be recognized.
How do you do? The ship that will be taking us to Rajdarika should be departing from the docks here in Trossum fairly soon now.
Rila pointed toward the seaside edge of Trossum, where Patrik could see the billowing sails of ships beyond the rooftops of the city.
We're just waiting for Triff to join us before we head over to the ship.
I take it that Triff is a Vorm.
Pethara had guessed from the name Triff and from the fact that Rila was scanning the sky with a hand over her eyes to block out the rays of brilliant sunlight. Rila nodded her head and Pethara fought back her urge to sneer with disgust.
Great! We shall have a fluffy rat along for the trip as well. Why not? Nothing else about this trip has come to plan so far.
Pethara disliked the Varm species based on the research that she had done on them. Varm can only be understood by those with whom they have bonded. To everyone else on Ytralas, their language sounded like a series of cooing, meowing gibberish. Even if Pethara hadn't come to find their language annoying, she would still find them difficult to trust, as it was well known that they held close ties with the Dark Titan god Rebuk, gifting them the power of stealth magic known as shadow walking. It made the Varm excellent hunters, but even better thieves and assassins.
Would you mind terribly if we went on ahead and met you at the ship then? I should like to get settled as soon as possible. I have work to do.
No, please. Go get yourselves situated on the ship. We shall be setting sail on the Andine, on the far left end of the docks. Go on ahead. We shan't be far behind you.
Rila watched Pethara and Davomir as they walked away, disappearing into the crowds. There was still no sign of movement in the sky above them, and so Rila turned to gaze onto her escort. There was something about him which she could not place her finger on. Although she found him to be attractive, there was another feeling inside of her that she could not identify, and it was making her nervous. Rila's cheeks flushed then, as she suddenly realized that she had been staring at him.
Oh, looks like I've arrived at just the right moment.
The Varm purred from above with a coy smile upon her furry lips, her eyes bouncing between the two humans.
You're late, Triff. We must get going. The others have already set out for the ship.
Rila lifted her bags and shortly thereafter felt the weight of Triff settling across her shoulders. The additional weight caused her to sway unsteadily on her feet.
You are lucky that we did not leave you behind.
She snapped in annoyance under her breath. Triff simply chuckled in response. Allow me to assist you, my lady. Emery offered, taking Rila's bag from her shoulder. He was surprised at the weight of the bag and realized from the clinking sounds within that it was filled with coin.
She must be carrying 100 coin in this bag. I suppose she must be taking on the role of benefactor from her aunt.
He hefted her bag over his shoulder and motioned towards the docks. After you. Waterflies flopped about inside of Rila's nervous guts. Her palms grew moist with sweat, and her throat felt drier than cotton. The back of her neck grew hot quickly under the warmth of the sun and Triff's thick fur.
Thank you, Sir Emery.
Rila stammered nervously as she began to power walk toward the Andine. She didn't want him to notice the mortified mask upon her face in that moment. She couldn't even begin to comprehend what her problem was, as she had never felt so nervous when speaking with anyone in the past. Suddenly, Rila was beginning to regret participating in this expedition. The city of Trossum was bustling and busy today, like most every day. Women toted their children along with their groceries up and down the streets, alongside the paroling guards in their clinking, glittering chainmail armor. Travelers and shoppers loitered in the various market stands with varying levels of interest, and loud shopkeepers yelled out grand promises for their common products. Still confused by her sudden anxious nerves, Rila strained to think of something to say to her new companion. Her mind betrayed her and sat as blank as fresh parchment.
I'm trying too hard at this. Have you ever traveled outside the city, Sir Emery?
The Knights Guild is based in Caliphus, my lady. I've been to many cities.
Rila's heart felt as though it had been squeezed with an ancient giant folk's hand as she thought to herself.
I knew that. He must think I'm an absolute simpleton. What's wrong with me today?
Longshoremen, fishermen, and travelers rushed around the docks at the hastened paces of those with somewhere else to be and little time to spare.
Over there.
Emery tilted his head to the left, indicating which ship was the Andine. At the base of the ramp to the ship, Pethara stood with her arms crossed in impatience. Devamere stood beside her, looking uncomfortable and shifty.
Sorry that we're late.
Rila said, though she knew that the captain would have waited for her. Narama's coin and reputation would have prevented the man from daring to leave her behind. Emery didn't stop the chat, but instead made his way onto the deck and slipped from Rila's view.
Driff, this is Pethara and Sir Davamere de Sobres of Caliphus. They are the travelling companions that, Aunt Narama mentioned?
Again, Davamere gave only a curt nod in response. Pethara plastered a fake smile across her face and warmly greeted Triff, who threw her nose up in the air in response.
Do not mind Triff. You know how Vorm can be with their mood swings.
If Triff could have murdered Rila with her gaze, then the human girl would have perished on the spot.
You started this, remember that.
Triff snorted and decided to ignore them all entirely.
Have you already settled into your cabins?
Aye, we're just holding seasickness at bay whilst we wait for the captain to make way. I am surprised that the Vorm wishes to join us. They are notoriously frightened of water, are they not?
Triff continued to ignore their conversation and instead watched the other humans scurrying about the deck.
Triff has been on quite a few expeditions in the past. I'm certain that she's become accustomed to it by now. She's been, my Aunt Narama's bar's somewhere for some time, and they've travelled to the western continent before.
Speaking of which, why is your aunt not accompanying us on this expedition? I cannot help thinking that this would be the most rewarding of research projects for any scholar, let alone one that has been so passionately researched in the Isles as she. Not that I can blame her, mind you. I have my own obsession with the islands, without the dramatic attachment.
Emery returned Sans luggage and stood nearby to watch over Rila and the other passengers boarding the ship. Rila winced at Pethara's words and replied,
My aunt has serious business that she must attend to, and sadly, the circumstances have prevented her from joining us. She sent a request to Caliphus asking that Sir Emery be sent to watch over me during this expedition in her stead. I was honestly surprised that they agreed to send a knight to watch over me, as I'm no one special after all, unlike my aunt.
This time it was Emery who winced. He had not been enlightened with this information before, and it caught him off guard. Until now, he had been under the impression that the Knight Commander had chosen him for this pathetic babysitting job. Pethara silently admitted that she had never heard of Rila before today and agreed that the young girl was probably nothing special. In Pethara's many rotations of study, she had met many scholars from the Kingdom of Nath, but she hadn't even been aware that Narama had a niece until now. Not wanting to be rude, Pethara simply replied,
I see.
All aboard for the Undane. Send sail for the coast of Rajtarika. 'Tis your first, last, and only call. We be pulling up the ramp and making way in 5.
The group quickly scurried up the ramp. Triff hissed at the open water beneath them as it splashed up along the wooden planks of the hull.
My lady.
Emery stood waiting at the top of the stairs which led down into the Undine's belly.
Your cabin is this way.
Rila flashed one last smile at Pethara before she obligingly followed Emery down the damp wooden steps, which creaked and squeaked beneath their feet as he led her below deck. The air felt stale, salty, and thick with humidity. Here, he said, stopping in front of the door. His eyes wandered up and down his ward as he stood waiting for her to enter the room, with a look of boredom upon his face.
Where is your cabin, Sir Emery?
He raised a suspicious brow to her question and pointed to an adjacent door.
I shall reside next door to you, of course, my lady.
He was surprised that she would even ask such a question, as it was basic protocol for any Nathan nobility traveling outside of the kingdom. He wondered how often this young lady had previously been allowed to travel, if at all.
Oh, that's good to know. Thank you.
Irritated at Rila's lack of speed, Emery opened the door to her cabin and ushered her into the room.
Scream for me if you're dying.
The thudding sound of wood against wood signaled the door being pulled closed behind her.
Oh, this was such a foolish idea.
Rila flung herself onto her cot and Triff fluttered onto the dresser, sporting a glare of displeasure.
Ugh, yuck! The air is so salty and moist here. How long until we reach land again?
If only that were my largest concern at the moment.
You're the one who wanted to tag along on this expedition. You are the one who decided that this was all a fabulous idea. You have no one to blame for this but yourself.
Rila slowly raised her face from the cot where she had been smashing it.
Oh, I had little choice in the matter, and I had no way of knowing that it would be like this. If only you could understand what I'm going through, then you wouldn't be so quick to judge me.
Ha! 'Tis a bit late for regrets now. The ship has already parted from the docks.
Rila lifted herself into a sitting position and watched as the shoreline began to slip away from her view. She retorted sleepily,
"'Twas a bit late long ago."
She had been under immense stress before embarking on this voyage, and the excess anxiety had left her in a constant state of exhaustion.
I only have one rotation.
Rila drifted off to sleep, her expression remaining crimped with worry.
One rotation. More than enough time to learn the secrets of the universe if pressed.
The humid sea air was frizzing up Triff's fur and making her feel grumpy. The moisture caused her fur to cling against the membrane of her wings and made them feel itchy. She ruffled her fur and settled atop the dresser for a catnap of her own. Her narrowed olive eyes slowly blanked to a close as the rocking of the ship caused her to sway, a sensation which the Varm found to be irrationally soothing. Emery sliced through the air with his sword as his feet danced gracefully across his cabin floor. Having safely escorted his ward into her cabin, Emery had strode into his own. He was quickly stricken with boredom and decided to exercise to pass the time and keep his skills sharp.
I was meant to be conscripted to the front lines of the eastern border. They could not have put me further from the action, and on a babysitting job no less. I did not train my entire life just to sail away from the danger.
Emery spun on his heel and used the momentum to swipe his sword at the imagined enemy before him. Nothing could calm Emery's temper more thoroughly than to practice the basics of his swordplay. His mind was jumbled, filled with angered and confused thoughts. He couldn't grasp why his superiors would conscript him to such a quest. It hadn't been but 3 weeks since Emery had passed his initiation into the Knights Guild, and he had been promised a conscription to fight on the faltering front lines of Eastern Nath. Instead, he was following some rich noble's brat to the ends of Ytralas, an unsuitable duty for a knight of his potential. He wanted to fulfill his real purpose. He wanted his revenge.
Oh, think, Emery, think! What could have happened to change their minds? Does the Lady Narama truly hold such sway within the Knights Guild that she could have chosen a particular knight to guard over her niece? Or had she simply requested a knight to play bodyguard, and I was the unlucky soul chosen to fill the role? Oh, surely if the world-renowned Marked had the ability to choose her niece's guardian, she would have chosen someone more qualified and experienced than me.
Complicating Emery's celebration was the sense of guilt that he felt over his anger. He understood that it was his duty to follow his orders, regardless of his feelings on the matter. It was a matter of honor for Emery to complete this quest, to prove himself the worthy knight he claimed to be.
Perhaps the Knight Commander wanted proof of my ability before sending me off to battle the Bokanite. Maybe they will conscript me to the front lines once I've returned the rich brat home to Nate safely.
It was then that Emery found his thoughts pirouetting onto the subject of his quest, the Lady Rila Dianandra of Atham. He thought of the way that her greystone eyes had lit up like glittering silver coins whenever she had turned her gaze upon him, the way that her supple flesh had peeked out from the bust of her gown, the graceful way in which she seemed to float above the ground as she had walked through the city. Emery chuckled softly to himself and thought,
would it not be interesting if I'm proven right in assuming her interest? This expedition is meant to last for an entire rotation, after all. There will be plenty of time to test out my theory.
Realizing that he had become engrossed within his impure thoughts and had lost his focus, Emery shook his head to clear them and returned to his practice. It wasn't long before his thoughts returned to that of his mission as he swung his sword about the cabin.
My rotations of training, all my hard work, all of my sacrifices, I cannot let them be for naught. Sir Forvalus would not have taken such an interest in me just to send me to the Western Continent. Would he? Did he lie when he promised that I would be conscripted to the front lines? What of my revenge? What of my so-called destiny?
Again, Emery shook his head to clear it of such thoughts. He refused to believe that Sir Forvalus would ever lie to him, and a Temple Mother was the last person that he would expect to hear spouting falsehoods. Emery sighed in frustration and dropped onto the floor. He pressed his back against the wall that his room shared with Rila's and leaned his head against the cool wood. He was able to note that her room was silent, a good sign that all was well with his ward for the moment. His eyes affixed themselves onto a knot in the floor as he silently allowed his ponderings to overtake his mind, while being mindful to stay alert for the sounds of distress from the room next door.
You might as well have been shouting from the rooftops that you're a wanted lad, you dumbass. Telegraph much?
The irritated Moran asked him with a mocking expression gracing her features. She stood in Davomir's cabin, looking at him in disapproval as she scolded him. Davomir stood silently with his head held high, allowing Pethara to chastise him.
If I had not known before today, I would have figured it out by the time we reached the bloody ship. I find it difficult to believe even that nitwit niece of Lady Naroma's did not pick up on it. When did you become such a jittery mess, Davomir?
I am sorry, all right. For the last time, I said I'm sorry. I'm not being this close to the capital since, well...
Yeah, just keep that testosterone-fueled paranoia under wraps from now on, lest you get us both into trouble. I highly doubt you need to worry about the Knights Guild on the Western Continent anyways. So take a deep breath and relax already. You've been shaking like a pair of brothel titties all day.
Davomir took Pethara's advice and filled his lungs with the musty sea air of his cabin. She was right, and he knew it. They were leaving the kingdom of Nath behind them, and all his troubles with the Knights Guild would be left behind with it. Davomir slowly let his breath out and asked,
I thought you told me that you were coming here to study with a highly respected Trossum researcher. I did not expect to board the ship to the Western Continent, nor did I expect her.
Davomir could feel his stress begin to melt away with the view of Nath's kingdom on the horizon.
Well, that makes two of us then. My intentions were to study under Lady Naroma de Laslan, the headmistress of research for the Trossum libraries and one of your kingdom's most highly respected scholars. She also happens to be the world's leading expert on human and Bollard history. But most importantly, she is one of the few humans to survive the magic of the island's barrier.
It was that last part which truly drew Pethara's interest to this marked. She would have paid nearly any price to gain access to the woman, and she was deeply displeased with this recent turn of events.
'Twas not until I received the last raven that I was informed 'twould not be possible. 'Tis all bloody mysterious and curious to me. If there was anyone in this world to be invested in this campaign, 'twould be that lass. And yet she has sent her niece in her stead. Why?
Pethara tapped a finger against her cheek, clearly lost in thought. Devermeer rubbed his fingers over his suddenly throbbing temples. The unpleasant headache had been growing progressively worse throughout the day.
Does it matter? I thought you wanted to research the Isles, not some old woman.
Pethara snorted but didn't respond. Suddenly feeling agitated, Devermeer went on to ask,
Would you mind musing about this elsewhere? I have a headache.
Without a word of reply, still lost in thought, Pethara wandered over to the door and let herself out. As soon as the door to his cabin closed, Devermeer laid down on his cot to nap. Though he loved his traveling companion dearly, Pethara certainly knew how to get on his nerves at times. He imagined that this is what it would feel like to grow up with an older sister. She had barged into his cabin to yell at him, but he knew that her intentions were good. Should Devermeer be exposed before the ship made land, they would be forced to kill all of the passengers and take over the ship. A deed neither he nor Pethara would prefer to enact. Pethara, on the other hand, was freshly awake with most of the world. She was ready to dig in for the day's studies and was hopeful that she could uncover something new. There was plenty of information for her to brush up on before they reached the lands of the Western continent. Her knowledge of the geography there was lacking, and Pethara hated to feel ignorant. She entered her own cabin and sat up on the floor, pulling papers from her satchel and poring over them. The papers contained information about the continent, the Isles of Pi, and the flying cities of the Bolad, along with many other topics of interest. As the Undine rolled over the choppy blue waters of the Nashinan Sea, there rose broad, scale-covered, and sharp-tipped plates behind it. The Nashinan Sea was restless as it thrust cresting waves upon the Undine's bow. Loud shouting and the thudding of feet upon the deck had drawn the interest of Pethara, her traveling companions, and a handful of other passengers.
Hogan, stand athwart ship and take in these lines. Liam, check the breakwater for damage. Cled, I need you at the helm. Keep her under a knot and do not dare to let her heading wane an inch.
What do you suppose this is all about?
Simple, stupid. We're under attack.
Attack? By who? I see no other ships.
Pethara rolled her eyes and pointed to the aft port side of the ship. There, peeking through the jagged waves of the sea, rose a line of webbed spikes.
By the Titan gods! What is that thing?
'Tis Iridia. I'd not thought to see one in my lifetime.
The Undine's crew rushed to adjust her sails and drive the wind out of harm's way. As the spine-covered back of the Iridia stalked them from the choppy water surrounding them.
I'm guessing that they're not the friendly sort.
You think?
Rows of scale-covered spikes scraped along the bottom of the ship as the Iridia swam beneath it from one side to the other. For a long and drawn-out moment, there were no signs of the pursuer. Then, without a warning, a loud banging sound filled the night air, and the Undine began to lift from the sea.
Quick! Grab onto something! The ship is about to capsize!
Panic-filled screams erupted from the crew as the ship listed heavily to the side. Turbulent waves splashed over the bow of the ship and threatened to swallow her within its liquid darkness.
Stay out of the lane! Out of the lane!
The crewmate Cled spun the wheel of the ship as quickly as he could, with as much force as he could muster, and the wood of the Undine's belly crackled under pressure as its one remaining rudder in the water pivoted. The ship turned away from the direction it had been leaning and came crashing back down into its natural, upright position. The ropes which held aloft the sails snapped and swung carelessly through the air, and 2 of the crew members of the ship clung to the railing as they hung precariously over the edge. Devomir slapped Emery in the chest.
We need to go help them.
As the 2 knights rushed to save the men overboard, Bethara spun in circles on her toes, her eyes vigilantly searching the waves for their pursuer. She didn't have to wait long before the Rydia finally chose to rear its head above the waves. The water Ophidian stretched open its massive jaws and let out a bone-chilling roar.
We must be careful in how we deal with this. I'm uncertain of how much more stress this ship can survive.
If you wish to play it safe so that no one gets hurt, then go protect the passengers and leave this to me, human. I have no time to play caregiver.
Rila shook her head in disgust at Bethara's response, but proceeded to usher passengers back below deck. A soft green glow began to emanate from the Rydia's throat before it loosed a high-powered burst of water at the Undine. Had this blow landed on the ship, it would surely have torn it asunder. Instead, Bethara threw her hands into the air and deflected it back into the sea. Their ship rocked from side to side as the effects rippled through the sea beneath them. The creature reached for the ship with its large hand, and as its outstretched webbed claws drew near to the ship, Devomir leapt through the air. His sword made contact with one of the creature's thick, sharp fingers and sliced it clean off. The Rydia roared angrily and ducked back into the water.
Where did it go? Can anyone see it?
Our group of heroes peered over the bow of the ship into the dark and murky sea below, searching for disturbances in the waves. Again, the Rydia bucked with its tail from beneath the ship and sent it flying upwards. The sound of screaming passengers from the lower decks made it difficult for our heroes to discern whether they were hearing waves or the movements of the creature.
Oh, will you just shut the feck up already? You're giving me a headache!
She cried out in pain as she flew over the bow of the ship and sunk through the waves of the sea.
Bethara!
Devomir grabbed one of the hanging ropes from the mast of the ship, tied it quickly around his waist, then dove overboard after Bethara. Emery rushed to grab hold of the rope attached to Devomir and peered into the water.
Emery! Look out!
Another high-powered spray of water flew across the deck, aimed squarely at Emery. Seeing this, Rila threw her arms forward and cast a spell which pierced through the water and sent it splashing back harmlessly into the sea. Devomir surfaced with Bethara in his arms, and Emery pulled them back up onto the ship.
Are you two all right?
Get out of my way! This is not finished!
Bethara pushed Emery away from her once she was back on her feet. She stomped across the ship and screamed angrily at the Rydia as it prepared to lob another spray of water.
Oh, water me!
The cry of her water spell echoed on the breeze as the Rydia's eyes began to widen and its head began to buck. The creature thrashed about and made horrendous choking sounds.
Bethara, stop! What are you doing? You're going to kill it!
That is the point, you dumbass!
That Ophidian is probably 300 rotations old, perhaps older. You cannot just murder it for protecting its territory. Let it go!
What is happening to that thing? Looks like a squid's got him by the jollies.
Bethara has a connection to Phelan. She's grabbed a hold of the water in its throat and is drowning it.
The Rydia's thrashing grew more and more desperate, sending even larger waves to slap against their ship. The choking noises coming out from its throats grew weaker.
You think it will just leave us be if I release it? This thing is dangerous. Just think of how easily it could have downed the Undine without us aboard to save her.
Is it worth capsizing the ship just to teach that thing a lesson?
Fine! But if it comes back, don't come crying to me for saving!
Pethara released her hold, and the beast immediately dove back into the ocean. Rila was disappointed in Pethara's actions, and her features bore an expression to show it. Devamir squeezed ocean water from his shirt and then patted Emery on the back.
Thanks for the hand back there.
Emery peered over the edge of the ship, then turned back to Devamir and asked,
What? So we shan't be having an Ophidian for dinner then? I was hoping to find out what a water dragon tastes like.
Pethara shot up on her cot in a cold sweat. The warm summer breeze drifted in through the window and stirred the sprigs of dry hair atop her drenched forehead. Her chest heaved heavily as she tried to catch her breath. She sat there in silence while the last remnants of grogginess cleared from her mind.
Was it a nightmare? No, this is something else.
She could sense an immense source of power radiating nearby. Wave after wave of the magical energy slammed against Pethara's body as she wrestled her breathing under control.
Where in the name of Mo is that coming from?
She tossed her blanket aside and swung her legs over the edge of her cot and snuck through the door of the cabin and out into the bowels of the ship. Without the wall of her room to buffer the waves of energy emanating from this unknown source, they began to hit her with a much stronger force. Pethara cringed and peeked down the hallways of crates and supplies, but saw no one else outside of their cabins. Footsteps above Pethara's head informed her that there were still 2 men active on the deck. One was tapping his foot at the helm, and the other was patrolling about. Slowly and carefully, Pethara began to sling through the ship towards this mysterious source. A pit of nervousness began to rise in her stomach as she crept across the creaking wooden planks. She could sense that this magical connection was stronger than her own, and it frightened her. She swallowed hard. Her mouth was dry and tasted of old mead. Though she could sense that this unknown power surpassed her own, Pethara was finding it difficult to attribute it to any of her fellow passengers. She had studied them all, one by one, as they had scurried about the ship earlier in the day. Devamir and Emery were stronger in connection than the few other passengers she had sensed magical energy within. The sole exception had been that of Rila, who seemed to be nearly as powerful as a child. Pethara had sensed no connection carrying such strength aboard the Undine before now.
How could I have missed this? What could this person possibly be casting which would cause such ripples to pass throughout the ship? And who could be so powerful as to cause this in the first place?
Abruptly, the waves of energy ceased. Pethara could feel an echoing tingle on her flesh where the vibrating waves had once been. She stood with her feet locked onto the wooden floor of the hallway.
You shall not slip my gaze so easily.
Pethara announced angrily as she reached out her hand. She closed her eyes and focused her powers to sense for any trace of residual energy that might lead her to the now inactive power source.
Oh, feck!
Pethara swore angrily as she dropped her arm to her side. She stood there for a moment, still and silent as her mind raced. She couldn't imagine how such a powerful magical connection could have boarded the ship without her detecting it. It left her frustrated with her failure and angry that she was unable to hunt it down before it disappeared. But most of all, Pethara was afraid of the unknown spell which had been cast on her ship, in the middle of the ocean and in the middle of the night. Whatever this source had been, whomever it was that held this connection to the Titan gods, had been able to hide their power from Pethara. That was something she had thought that only the matriarchs of Mo could accomplish, and she had been under the impression that no human could hold such a connection to the gods. However, She had noticed no other Moor on board the ship. Pethara would normally have assumed this sort of spell to be the dark magic of the Bokenite, yet the energy that she had felt radiating throughout the ship had felt more alien than foul. Feeling confused but tired, Pethara finally relented and turned back to her quarters. The further that she traveled from the eastern continent, the more uneasy Pethara was beginning to feel. Ever since she had stepped foot on this rotting floater, something had felt wrong. Pethara pulled open the door to her cabin and slunk back inside. With a sigh, she crawled back into bed and slid under the covers. She stared at the rafters of her ceiling, mind lost in looping ponderings, until sunlight began to stream across her room. Davomir stood, shifting his weight uncomfortably as Pethara spoke to him. He had sensed nothing that could match her accusations, and he was uncertain if he should worry for her safety or her sanity.
Are you certain that this was not, a dream?
Are you serious? I know the difference between the waking world and the dreaming world. Thank you very much, sis.
Pethara glared down at him as her hands tightly gripped the railing of the Andine's deck.
I should like to know the intentions this stranger had in mind when casting such a spell. It was unlike anything I have ever encountered before.
Pethara's eyes searched across the brilliant blue ocean waters surrounding them, as though they might hold answers for her.
No Bokenite have ever been sighted on the western continent, right? I doubt we sailed the first ship to bring them across the sea, and I doubt the captain would have allowed a taken mark to board his ship.
If you men were smart enough to know the signs, perhaps.
Pethara quickly bit her tongue, angry with it for betraying her. Misandry was a deep-rooted issue within the matriarchy of Mo, and it was a flaw that Pethara had been striving to improve upon. Davomir alone had already proven to her that men were no less capable than women, at least in some cases.
I sensed no connection with the strength required to produce such energy amongst our fellow passengers. And I have no way of knowing what sort of spell was cast without finding the source. That worries me, Davomir.
Pethara confided to him. It was the first time that Davomir had ever heard a waver in her voice.
If you sense this power again tonight, you should come straight away to fetch me before pursuing it.
I should come fetch you straight away, should I? No clothing or anything first?
No, of course not. Titan gods, Pethara. Why must you always take the piss? Heck's sake. If there is a danger aboard the Undine, then the last thing you should be doing is sneaking alone towards the danger. Promise me.
You win, sis. I promise that I shall find you if I sense this magic again. In the meantime, keep your wits about you.
You should always keep your tits about you. Where else would you keep them?
Pethara spun around quickly in shock.
Lady Rila!
She had sensed other passengers sauntering back and forth across the deck, but she hadn't sensed Rila approaching them at all. Pethara scolded herself for the instant hypocrisy, telling Davomir to keep his guard up whilst allowing her own to drop.
We were just discussing... You did not happen to notice anything odd last night, did you?
Notice anything odd? Like what?
Pithara debated upon how much information she wanted to share with her new companion. There was something about Rila which rubbed Pithara the wrong way, but she simply could not place her finger upon why. Still, if they were to be traveling together as companions over the next rotation, she would have to allow the girl opportunities to prove herself. Pithara admitted reluctantly.
Late last evening, I sensed powerful magic emanating from somewhere aboard the ship, but I was unable to trace it back to its mark.
Really? Oh, I am sorry, Pithara. I cannot say that I sensed anything last night. I went straight to sleep after that awful mess with the Rydia and didn't wake up until this morning. What sort of powerful magic?
I do not know. I could only sense that the connection was to a Titan god in which I do not pray, of which there are many. Would you please let me know if you sense anything from the other passengers?
Pithara expected no less. She found it difficult to believe that this waif could sense her own magical connection, much less that of others. It had been a foolhardy notion on her part to think that this girl could offer assistance. Rila flashed a cheerful smile and replied,
Yes, of course. We are in this together, are we not? We have a few days yet before we reach the shore, and I came to ask you if you'd like to go over some of the research that my aunt lent me for this expedition. You can never be too prepared when intending to attempt the impossible, right?
Pithara's ears perked with interest immediately at the prospect of perusing the Elder Mark's research. She eagerly agreed as, after all, Pithara's original intention had been to study with Narama. These papers could offer her the opportunity to yet learn something. Devamir watched Pithara follow Rila across the deck and down the stairs with sullen concern. He worried for Pithara's safety now that he was aware of potential danger lurking within the ship. The nervous paranoia that had been draining from him since leaving Nath was beginning to burrow back into the pit of his stomach. His eyes swept over the ship, assessing those around him. He could sense only one of the crew to be marked, but Devamir could easily overpower this man. There was a marked woman leaning over the railing on the opposite side of the ship, yet he could sense that her connection was also much weaker than his own. At supper the previous evening, Devamir had crossed paths with a marked man that had been chatting with another passenger. The man had mentioned being a Sharda from Tordosia, heading home to his family, an unlikely candidate. In fact, most of the passengers aboard the Andine appeared to be heading home to Tordosia, along with a few traveling merchants. None stood out to Devamir as potentially dangerous. He thought to himself,
No wonder Pithara is concerned.
Devamir could handle giant creatures, crazy magics, and all the monstrosities which Ytralos had on offer. But there was nothing that Devamir could do against an unknown enemy. A fact that scared him far more than any monster ever could. Greetings once more, wonderful watchers. I would like to take this opportunity to thank you all for your likes, your subscriptions, and your time. You are truly a beautiful soul, and you are deeply appreciated. You deserve to know that we have a Patreon page available for you to join, at your kind leisure, of course. The YouTube algorithm is worse than a rampaging horde of Bokanite, and our generous patrons allow us to continue our battle against it. Furthermore, there are certain episodes that YouTube would frown upon, and thus are only available to our patrons. Please do think it over, and enjoy the rest of your day.